Before we start off onto the topic, I'm so delighted and honored to have Asif Iftikhar with us. I have known him for quite some time, and the more I know him, the more I'm amazed with his scope and breadth of and deep depth of knowledge. Both, it's not just very extensive; it's very intensive as well. He is right. He's a fellow at the Al Mawrid. Is that the right name to pronounce it, Asif? Al Mawrid?
You got the pronunciation right.
Okay. Foundation for Islamic Research. He's a big one there. And he's also a member of the social science faculty at LUMS. He has been teaching courses related to Islam, Islamic law, business ethics, and communications for more than 7 years now. He also serves as a member of the UBL, the bank's Sharia Advisory Board. I did not know that, Asif. And he has a rich and wide teaching experience of 15 years in different national and international
30,
institutions.
30, that's 30 years.
30 years now. Oh my God.
Thank you for making me younger.
Please, you, Asif, I thought was younger than that.
30 years, yes.
Okay. And you have actually you teach at the Civil Services Academy, at Nippon National Institute, and then you, of course, Administrative Staff College, Punjab University, and of course your parent, your alumni of McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And you have also worked in different capacities in Al Mawrid and other institutions. You hold a master's degree, finance from Punjab and Islamic studies from McGill University. And you have been under the informal tutelage of Mr. Ghamidi. I'm sure a lot of the faculty know about Ghamidi Saab, and he is very well respected for his knowledge and Islamic, knowledge of jurisprudence, if I may say so.
I've been one of the formal students, not informal students.
Okay, so you have been
one of the oldest alive formal students.
Wow. So you are a graduate also of HSN College. That's good to know. That's where my sons graduated. But more than that, Asif, I must say that this CV doesn't do justice to who you are, to your knowledge and to your knowledge base. And I will, leave you to take charge of this session. We are talking about epistemology of theories of research. And of course, you are again going to explain to me what is epistemology. For the sake of everybody else, if I may say, you were requested to sort of see a video on the session, which was by Sikandar, and you had to come up with some queries. And we have shared it with Asif, we have shared it with you.
Thank you very much, Rukhsana, for the introduction. I should like to clarify a few basic ideas that are important in research, because if you go into epistemology as a branch of philosophy, one can go on and delve deeper and deeper into aspects that might not be so directly relevant to all researchers, but some of the more practical aspects are what I'd like to talk about and how it relates to. And I'd like to give a few examples from different fields, particularly my own. Okay, to begin with, the first aspect of what really epistemology is, you've already gone through some sessions and lectures, so I don't need to repeat what you've already understood. I'm going to talk about what you might not have delved into. Most of you are researchers yourselves, so you are already aware of many aspects that were discussed, but just sharing some of the aspects that I found very relevant, both in my research, in my supervision of research, and also in teaching research. So one of those aspects in terms of epistemology, which Professor Sikandar also talked about, that aspect of epistemology has to do with the difference between veracity and truth, because somehow this is the pitfall here. The people's, because the root comes from experience. Empiricism is quite often related to it, but it's much beyond. It's way deeper than just empirical experience. That's just one aspect. People might have studied or heard about Descartes here, his famous cogito idea of I think, therefore I am. But that's kind of been disparaged as an internal way of looking at a phenomenon. And then the understanding between phenomenon and what Kant called noumenon is also an important idea. And since the time of the dawn of logical positivism, which really had a big impact on the way we looked at things and the way we believed in things and the way we categorized truth and fact, as opposed to modern ideas, contemporary ideas on veracity. There has been a lot of rethinking. There has been a lot of reversion or reverting back to some original ideas, even pre-Greek ideas, because they were too easily disparaged at times. So what I'm doing right now is also a kind of critique on what you might have already gone through in your lecture.
Is an accounted truth that is accounted for is considered veracity? I'm just doing a literal understanding.
One of the ideas जो empiricism का idea है, demonstration का है, फिर Karl Popper बात करते हैं, falsification का. Theory of science became a very important notion. And in modern times, what most research has suffered from, if I dare say that, and a lot, I'm only kind of venturing into the enterprise of proffering that idea, because I've seen some of the best known professors in the field, including Professor Robert Wisnowski from Harvard, under whom I studied. In fact, I did a lot of work, some work on Muslim epistemology under his supervision, because he's one of those people who combines the Greek and Latin and Arabic and Persian notions to look into some of these ideas on epistemology. So on their authority and by virtue of the corroboration of some of these notions that I'm sharing with you, the idea of science as being the only valid episteme for reaching conclusions that could be categorized as facts is a notion that has been very strongly challenged in modern times. So जहां तक आपने लेक्चर में सुना है अभी, वहां बात वही हो रही है कि जी पहले epistemology का फील्ड क्यों important हो गई, because there were philosophers who were not easily accepting ideas that had generated from reflective thinking. That's इंसान ने गौर किया कायनात के ऊपर और उसके बाद रिफ्लेक्ट किया और notions develop करना शुरू कर दिए. Many of those notions were taken as belief statements and seen as truths by the people who believed in them. And then when you had people like Descartes and others who were looking at the whole idea of epistemology on the basis of internal notions of categorization, जिसको Kant phenomena के नाम से भी कहते थे, how much of reality is in our mind. I mean, I could give you 101 examples कि जहाँ पर आप वो खूबसूरती की मिसाल ले लें, यानी खूबसूरती की मिसाल ले लें, और ये मिसाल देना अच्छा ही लगता है हमेशा मुझे, क्योंकि मैं शायर भी हूँ, शायरी पढ़ाता हूँ लम्ज़ में. तो वो मशहूर शेर है ना जिसमें वो कहते हैं कि हम बाकी जो हसीनाएं थी, तो उन्होंने लैला से कहा कि तू हमें तू अज़हमें खूब नीस्ती, कि तुम बाकी खूबा जो हसीना है उनसे कोई ज्यादा खूब, तो उसने कहा खामोश हो तुम मजनून नीस्ती, तुम चुप करो, तुम मजनू नहीं हो, कि मजनू की आंख से मुझे देखोगे तो मैं सबसे हसीन तो मैं ही नजर आऊंगी. लेकिन that was one way of looking at things. Scientists actually about 15 years ago all across the world even tried सिकंदर आयात साहब ने उसका वो बात की थी, सिकंदर साहब ने मैथमेटिक्स की, तो दे ट्राई टू फॉर्मुलेट मैथमेटिकल फॉर्मूली and proportions to determine कि जो वर्ल्ड कंसेंसस है उसके मुताबिक अगर क्या proportions होते हैं जिसको खूबसूरत कहा जाता है. तो how much of that reality is inside is a huge aspect. तो वो जो idea था कि बस जो empirical evidence से साबित हो गया, that is the only valid episteme in research has been very strongly challenged. यानी सिकंदर साहब के जितने भी आइडियाज उन्होंने प्रेजेंट किए वो अपनी जगह बड़े इंपॉर्टेंट हैं और उससे बहुत डेवलपमेंट हुई बिलाशुबा. इब्न सीना हो या इब्न खल्दून हो, इब्न खल्दून ने सोशियोलॉजी में एम्पिरिकल रिसर्च की, इब्न सीना ने कुछ आइडियाज दिए जो चैलेंज किया. उससे पहले ग्रीक्स के यहाँ, फिर ग्रीक्स के यहाँ एनलाइटनमेंट के बाद वो सब आप पढ़ चुके हैं कि कैसे कैसे आइडियाज चैलेंज हुए. लेकिन I'll just give you one example of how even those epistemes can be problematic. और सिकंदर साहब ने वो गुफ्तगू के शुरू में मैथमेटिक्स के बारे में खुद ये बात कही कि मैं इसके बारे में ये बात उस तरह से नहीं कहता, अगरचे ये लोगों ने कहा इसके अंदर भी बहुत सारे नोशन जो हैं वो ह्यूमन कैटेगराइजेशन के इंटरनल मैकेनिज्म भी बेस्ड होते हैं. वो जो बात कहना चाह रहे थे वो गालिबन वही है. And I've shared many ideas with him. So through Ruxana he became a good friend. We've shared many ideas and I know he would agree कि ये जो categorization हम करते हैं, one क्या है? What is one? If I say this is one table and two tables, similar tables will, 1 plus 1 will make 2. Even before that, why am I not categorizing it as 5 planks of wood joined together rather than as one table? What exactly is 0 is also a notion that Stephen Hawking ने, for instance, creation के हवाले से nothingness की बात की, nothingness की. तो अब nothingness को and that's kind of presented as a scientific fact on his part. क्योंकि वो mathematical उस पे compositions, mathematical algorithms पे based है. लेकिन his idea of nothingness again is a categorization which is internal, right? तो वो nothingness के बारे में वो जो conception दे रहा है कि nothingness has an energy field and it has properties. This is very different from the idea of nothingness in the philosophical sense of the word, कि जहाँ पर जो first cause की बहस Thomas Aquinas ने की थी, वो बहस पैदा हुई थी. तो they are talking about two different notions, and the danger is that combining the two will create what in logic is called ignoratio lenchi, the fallacy of irrelevant conclusion, because what applies to nothingness, Stephen Hawking's nothingness, is different from और बिल्कुल कॉमन प्लेन पे जब वो बात करता है ना, उसके उनके इंतकाल के बाद उनका जो जुमला बड़ा मशहूर हुआ था कि I've seen many people who believe in predestination look both ways before crossing the street. To which I retorted by saying, I've seen many people looking both ways across the street and still meeting an accident.
When you write about limitations in a research approach, don't you sort of justify your stand about your opinion, the definitions,
yes,
where you're coming from?
That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point to which I'm coming. So what you have, I'll just give you one more example and then conclude my talk and then leave the rest to Q&A. Let's take the example of Louis Pasteur, for instance. In Louis Pasteur's time, many of you would know, especially from the field of science, that the idea of spontaneous generation became a very popular idea among scientists and was presented as a fact, as a scientific fact, because they were taking containers, and showing that life was generating out of nothingness, and kind of negated Thomas Aquinas's idea of the first cause. And that was seen as a huge leap. And in comes Louis Pasteur. At that time, the scientific community, the whole idea of what really makes science based on empirical kind of observation, experimentation, repetition of contingent factors that would create the same results, which kind of demonstrates, or in Karl Popper's terms, falsifies, as Pasteur did. And once a consensus of the scientific community develops that this is a valid kind of repetition under valid factors, it's seen as a fact. But in came Pasteur and pasteurized, those containers, and no life was generated, and it completely destroyed the whole idea of spontaneous generation. So what in epistemology we sometimes refer to as scientism, seeing everything from the scientific perspective, is also an important aspect. And in modern research, the idea of shared human experience and the shared tradition as valid epistemes for understanding social and hermeneutical realities has also become an important notion, as has the idea of intuition, which is shared by humans and can be demonstrated. So the point I'm trying to make is that after what you have learned from Sikandar's session, it's also important to understand what kind of research you're doing. And as Ruxana pointed out, these are things which you point out in your limitation. At times, you have to, because the whole idea of epistemology is to tell yourself as a researcher and tell your reader or audience what is what is the foundation from where you're getting your knowledge, and how, if I might use the word, reliable or verifiable that foundation is. For instance, when you say this is what Islam says, Islam prohibits Ruxana to do this Zoom session the way she's dressed up. If somebody comes up with this notion, I'm certain Ruxana will immediately say, where does Islam say that? Where does it say that? And maybe the other person is going to bring a hadith or a statement or the verdict of a scholar. And then, of course, it's kind of epistemic research to find out whether that hadith has some veracity. What are the different probability levels? And they were measured in the Islamic system in a different way, through different angles, ranging from the number of people who reported it, tawatur, khabar wahid. There's different categorization. Within khabar wahid, there's another categorization of daif, hasan, and sahih li ghairihi, and so on. And if you don't understand that, and you make statements, as so many people have done since 11 September, so many people have begun writing about Islam, social scientists, anthropologists, everybody has jumped into the field. And very few people even understand where the information is coming from, what is the level of veracity, especially in the academic community, how is it seen? So you have to identify those factors and see its limitations. There are limitations to scientific empirical evidence as well. Depending on what area you have. I have a friend here at LUMS where I teach, who was with me at McGill. We did our masters almost together, and then he went for his PhD to Harvard. And he has done a valid research based on intuitive understanding of the hospice phenomenon in South Asia, and that's more like intuitive understanding that's seen as a valid piece of research, obviously done at Harvard. So the point is whether you use empirical evidence or you use what Talal Asad would call the discursiveness of different traditions, or you use shared intuitive ideas or even personal intuitive ideas. The important aspect is, the important point is that you should be aware of these limitations and the scope. And vis-a-vis that, it is your responsibility as a researcher to explain to yourself, first of all, and then to your reader and audience, why you think that what you have concluded or what you have come up as a point of query is valid in terms of not your truth, but in terms of demonstrable veracity. So I'll just stop at that and wait for questions.
Yeah, but from what I understand, that's the basic of how you initiate your research. Once you, unless you ground yourself and explain to yourself and to your reader your philosophy and your of how you're going to approach and what what theory you're going to apply to your research, it makes immense sense. And then you will keep to that framework, that one, or you could mix up. I think at some points it could be both, in my lay term, subjective and objective combination of possibilities, right? So what we are saying is that as long as you ground yourself where you are and make yourself aware and the reader aware of the theory that you're going to follow for your research and how you're going to present your data, and your methodology will rely a lot on that to establish your credibility. I think the questions that I have with me, and I'll go through them just in case. I don't know what they said, but somebody wanted to know what is value pluralism, what is the role of critical theory, and what is the difference between liberalism and postmodernism and communitarianism. Now,
I've already. Okay, I'll just try to answer, respond to some of those questions. Each one of them is a huge topic with so many controversies.
I'm sure.
So Pella, which was the first one you said?
Value pluralism.
Yeah, and just give me three, and then I'll talk about three, and maybe we could talk about the next three then.
I think the most important would be then critical theory, liberalism, postmodernism.
Yeah. Yes, we will keep it to that and then move on from there.
Something else.
Okay. These are obviously, when you're doing your research, you are creating that idea of validity of your research and the validity of your approach, especially the epistemic and hermeneutical approach. Because if you don't understand epistemology or hermeneutics, which is going to be my next session, I believe, whatever, howsoever hard you have worked, whatsoever data you might have collected, I mean, in the end, it has to be, justified in terms of why you collected that data, where you got it from, which is epistemology, and how you're interpreting it, which in simple words is hermeneutical aspect. No wonder MIT has, even as Institute of Technology and Science, has spent so much and has invested so much in the field of hermeneutics. So when you're doing that, some of the ideas and notions in the academia at certain points become very important, and if I might use the word, fashionable as well. They become the in thing. One of which is the idea of value pluralism. And it's an important idea because in modern times, the idea of integrating the integrated approach towards research has become a very important idea. And one of the ways of doing that is to accept the validity of different approaches without letting one approach encroach upon another in a way as would diminish its role altogether. For instance, science typically, at least in our society, is still seen as pitted against humanities. Social sciences categorized differently, very differently from science. The idea of integrating all of these approaches is still not quite in vogue in our academic culture. But once you overcome some of those barriers, as people have tried quite successfully in the Western academia, you also have to understand that there's a certain epistemic pluralism which has to be accepted. For instance, when you talk about, I'm giving you an easy, to understand example, so that all participants are there. For instance, when you talk about religion, for instance, You talk about Christianity, you talk about even within one religious tradition, Islam, for instance, you're talking about Tawheed, the idea of oneness of God. And there is the Sufi approach and there is the Salafi approach, or pejoratively called the Wahhabi approach. And they're seen as contradictories. But when a researcher wants to, go into that, as a historian, for instance, he would be trained at times to see why within certain philosophical, social, cultural, theological foundations, the Sufis are categorizing Tawheed as Wahdatul Wajud, which is unity of being, or Wahdatul Shahud, and the Salafis are categorizing it differently. And in those terms, in terms of historical inquiry, it would create a pluralism where within the framework of the foundations of each notion, this person will be able to see them as valid part or parts of Islamic theological traditions. If you want to have an idea of what I'm talking about in more detail, because I don't want to go too much into that, there are other questions as well. If you want to have an idea vis-a-vis this particular example, there's a wonderful book that came out recently, and the author just died shortly before the book was published. It was published from Harvard by a Harvard scholar. His name is Dr. Shahab Ahmed, who passed away recently, and he came up with this book called What is Islam? About 700 pages of writing. It's really created a lot of ripples, talking about how value pluralism, has an impact on research into history. So that, as opposed to a confessional approach to study of religion, is something that will give you an idea. But again, there are critiques on this, but that's a separate question altogether. For instance, I myself talked to Shahab about this book and made some critiques, but I'm not going to talk about that because there are other questions as well. Unless you ask a question, then we can go into more details. दूसरा सवाल आपने क्या किया था? I've forgotten. It was about liberalism and postmodernism, I guess. That's what you talked about, Ruxana?
You're right, Asif. Liberalism and postmodernism.
Okay. So liberalism and postmodernism, and you talked about critical theory as well.
Yes.
So, yes, in fact, the two questions can be combined. Critical theory has become one of the most important aspects of academic pursuits in our times. In South Asia, and especially in the Pakistani context, in Urdu, one person who kind of really introduced the idea and then trickled down through him into universities was Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, who recently passed away. One of the biggest critics of, when I say critics, it doesn't mean a person who criticized, it means somebody who critically analyzed and commented on Mir Taqi Mir, was Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, and his other contributions to the field are well known to people who study literature. And in many of his works, and by works and in works by some of his colleagues, he's pointed out how criticism in our society was really lagged behind the Western notions of criticism, where so many theories have been combined, all these approaches that we're talking about. And it, in a certain sense, it began with a study of biblical literature. You all know about the Protestant Reformation, how the idea of how the Catholic epistemology looked at the consensus of bishops as kind of having the sanction of the Holy Spirit, and that being the final depiction of the intentionality of God. The idea of authorial intentionality is very, very important in terms of engagement with texts. In fact, Ruxana's son and I, he was my supervisee now, mashallah, working as dean at LUMS. The course that he did under me had a lot to do with engagement with texts. So when we engage with text, this idea of authorial intentionality, what is it that the author really wanted to say? Is it really possible to decipher it? Is it even possible, or does it kind of elude the reader, and how much is the reader responsible for giving meaning to it? We have people like Jacques Derrida with this idea of difference, contributing to critical theory over there. It's a huge question. It's a very loaded question. It's such a big topic. But the idea of how do I engage with text? How do I give meaning to it? How do I categorize something as good, bad, high quality literature, low quality literature, as something which creates a certain level of meaning, even dealing with ambiguity. Ambiguity is a huge issue. I just recently finished some research with King Fahd University on artificial intelligence hermeneutics, and we did an 80-page long paper on it, where they were trying to understand the mind of a creative writer, just just in the lighter vein. They initially wanted to wire my brain and see the way how the waves emerged in their equipment, whatever they had, to see what happens. And I said, all that's going to come out is a cup of tea, or maybe pictures of my wife, and if perchance somebody else's picture comes out, it will be very embarrassing. But what we ended up doing on my suggestion was looking at what makes a poet deliberately create ambiguity. Derrida talked about it, but in our discourses, there's this notion. Those of you who are aware of Urdu literature would know this concept of coming from the science of rhetoric in our languages, or ilme balaghat, the idea of sanat iham. We have different sanai. Poets would deliberately create layers of meaning and create ambiguity, and that was seen as an art. How do you engage with all that? How do you decipher authorial intentionality? Now, these ideas, it's a huge field, and if anyone is interested, a good introduction, a short introduction to critical theory is by Jonathan Culler. It's a very good introduction, which one can use as a starting point. So how do you engage with text? It's so important, because whether you talk about the Quran or the Bible or biblical studies, where hermeneutics really began from, or you talk about legal texts, or you talk about managerial texts, or you talk about scientific texts even, what is it that the text really means? What is it saying to you? How do you really determine? How do you give meaning to it? How do you reconcile with diachronic understanding versus synchronic understanding of the text? These are some of the aspects that critical theory has gone into. And unfortunately, most researchers in Pakistan are still very quite unaware of it. So they'll just pick up a text and say, for instance, I'll just give this example and then move on to the next question. I recently had a young girl who came to me from Punjab State. She'd done her MPhil. She wanted to write a paper. And every time I tell her, look, what you're doing is that you simply bring a text from the Quran, says, this is what the Quran says. In terms of critical theory, this is a very, very problematic statement. Because even in the tradition, on the base, the interpretation of the same verse in the tradition is so varied, sometimes conflicting. How have you just kind of just picked it up and said, this is what the Quran says? It's a very assertive. A researcher is not going to do that. So critical theory helps us to understand how one engages with the text. And when we talk about postmodernism, very simply, if I'm just oversimplifying it, if you had asked this question to Derrida, he would have kind of said that this is exactly what the kind of pitfall I would like to avoid, because as soon as you try to define postmodernism, you kind of critiquing it as well. or criticizing it as well. But the idea that you can just look at the text, and the text in terms of classical people of hermeneutics, romanticists like Schleiermacher, the idea that the text is sufficient unto itself. You open up a book, let's say the Quran or the Bible or Constitution, you look at it, and the text will be sufficient into itself, as opposed to what the reader would say that no, when the text was created, the writers, the founding fathers of the Constitution of US, for instance, had a very different notion. It's almost impossible diachronically. There's so much difference, deferment of idea, change in perception of reality, that it's not really now possible for you to go back to the original meaning. I usually give an example to explain this. For instance, if I say to my subordinate, look, I'm having guests from abroad, so please show them a good time while I'm away. What does it really mean? Or when I simply say the sentence, I love you, what does it mean? I mean, if it's a Madame Simone de Beauvoir, the mother of feminism, saying it to Jean-Paul Sartre, it would probably mean, as they defined it in their existentialist love, as not till death do us part, but till we find it relevant. It's a different notion of I love you. When I say show them a good time, and if my subordinate coming from HSN brings them a chateau of Lafitte Rothschild, a 2,000 bottle of wine, and the person, my guest comes from Tablighi Jamaat, it's not good time for him. So this, the idea of what I said, what I meant at that time, the whole notion of hermeneutical cycle, and how reader himself, the audience himself, kind of becomes part of creating the meaning, is something that directly relates to postmodernism, but it's a huge topic. I hope I've given you some notion, and it has had an immense impact in terms of criticism and research, because these notions of postmodernism have then challenged some of the long-held views based on the idea of authenticity of the text, and in terms of the veracity of the text, and also in terms of the univocal intentionality of the text, particularly in terms of the idea of univocal intentionality of the text.
Hello, Asif. Yeah. Very quickly, I think I'm going to, because we're running out, remove your biasness when dealing with value pluralism. But I think you gave that answer, because once you clarify your position, then you have removed the biasness. That is, there is a possibility of biasness arising from misunderstanding, because you put up the parameters of your philosophy and behind the research and the framework that you will use, right? That would be the simple answer, because you're stating it up front. So
yes, but that's one side of it. As I said, this is what Sikandar talked about. This is what Shahab Ahmed talks about, but there are criticism on it as well. For instance, when Shahab presented his book, he came to McGill when he had done his book, even before it was published. It was published posthumously after he passed away. But at that time, I had engagement, and some of my colleagues had asked me at LUMS to give my own views on it, and we did informal sessions. So here's the problem. Now, as a historian, obviously, when this is the example I gave, when he looks at Tawheed in terms of what the Salafis are saying, in terms of what the Sufis are saying, and he's seeing them pluralistically, and understanding what are the factors within which one group of people or one clique of scholars or theologians or mystics categorized as a valid understanding, as opposed to a contradictory notion, and why they were also valid. Shahab obviously had to concede that this would apply even to Taliban. Why is Taliban's Islam not equally valid? And he said, yes, it is. But the problem is that when I talked to him, I said, look, why is it not the historian's task? And when I say historian here, I also meant the researcher. Why is it not the historian's task to also engage with what I term as contestations? Because contestations have also been part and parcel of the tradition. And this is what the famous anthropologist Talal Asad, who along with McIntyre and Charles Taylor are seen as one of the biggest names in the field of modern anthropology, they also point out that, look, when you go into a field, the idea that fiqh Islam, which categorized as what was Islam and what was not Islam, what was valid Islam and what was not Islam, was doing a disservice, and the historian has to understand that pitfall and look beyond it. Yes, fine, that is true. But at the same time, the historian also has to deal with why these differences were there, how the contestations emerged, and perhaps at times, whether he likes it or not, at least in terms of the methodological approaches, give value judgments as well. So this is a question that remained contentious between Shahab and me.
Okay, so I hope you got your answer, somebody from Kuwait. I have Anmol, actually, she posed a question very early on, and I do not really understand her question, but she says that Asif talked about a return towards pre-Greek epistemologies. Could he please clarify which one are those? And I do not know why then, does he mean the likes of the Indian philosophical tradition or the Buddhist tradition, or to what extent is this trend rooted in decolonial and post-colonial critiques? So when you talk about pre-Greek epistemologies, the references to Indian or Buddhist traditions, or I don't know, even Chinese, because they were very old. But what did you mean exactly?
No, I mean, when we say pre-Greek, basically what, I mean, in philosophical parlance, it basically refers to, interesting as it may sound, they were also Greeks. But basically, Greek philosophy, as it was received by the Western world, was mostly a post-Socratic, philosophy. But there have been others like Epicureans and the Stoics and so many others before them, which somehow in the study of philosophy have been ignored, and there's a reignited interest. And of course, the Indian philosophy, which is very different in its background, has kind of re-emerged in what is now known as New Age philosophy. Okay. So those things, in fact, the New Age philosophy has, if you go to any bookstore anywhere in the Western part of the world, like US or Canada, England, because there's a huge Celtic belt there. There's an immense emergence. There's a lot of interest in magic, for instance. So easily dismissed by science.
Yeah.
But people have started looking into it again. Yeah. Why? And there's so many theories, so many books. If you go to any bookstore in some of these areas that I've pointed to, you'll be amazed that in any good bookstore, the biggest chunk will be on New Age philosophy. People are trying to understand. In the Celtic belt, for instance, in the Welsh belt, for instance, there's a huge movement which says that it was Christianity, and then the enlightenment period of after Dark Ages in Christianity, which imposed certain ideas, but our original ideas were very different. So and they're directly related to the Indian context, because some of the deities, some of the ideas coming originally from Babylonia, from Babylon, were shared. They were shared traditions before Christianity in the western part of the world, and Islam and Judaism in the other parts of the world. Kind of, I'm just explaining what people say. Right, before these traditions kind of imposed monotheistic notions of thinking about things. So there's a lot of re-emergence of, and I already talked about intuition, mysticism, spirituality. These are things that people are talking about. Tom Cruise came up with a new combination, hodgepodge of some of these ideas called Scientology.
Scientology, yeah, that's true. It's very interesting. I haven't really gone deeper into it, and I see that a lot of topics that were asked to be covered have actually been covered in the responses that you gave, like content analysis during critical theories. You covered that. How are these theories going to affect your research methodology? And I think we covered that while we were talking about it. And then there's, of course, collection of data, which will come later at some stages in our sessions. And but a good question that I would like you to respond is, how can we relate empiricism with the natural sciences? And that is, seems very interesting. Would you care to sort of very quickly respond to that?
Yes, that's I was hoping that somebody would ask that question.
Yeah, very
Because
interesting.
initially I had, of course, this is not what I'm saying is not to disparage science at all. There's almost so much to science and to scientific approaches, which, by the way, are never a monolithic whole. There are a host of approaches which can be categorized as scientific approaches. So there's no one single approach. But generally speaking, if you look at philosophers from the times of logical positivism to post-Popperian, ideas, the general consensus would be that anything that is if I might use Popper's terminology, which can be falsified, or if I might use the logical positivist notion, which can be verified. How do you falsify something? How do you verify something? The factors themselves that are researched have to be those that can, number one, be kind of observed, touched through our five senses, perceived through our five senses. Then they can be they have to be of the kind which can be subjected to certain conditions to produce predictable results, or results that can be projected through mathematical formulae or projected back through mathematical algorithms. So that will typically be seen, and then there's a consensus. This is now important. This is where you almost have social sciences and humanities coming in, and then there's also the consensus, almost the bishop-like consensus of established scientists who verify that. That is what makes it, because if it's one person's kind of thing which cannot be demonstrated and verified by other scientists, then it's problematic. This is a general notion. When Allama Iqbal, wrote his Metaphysics of Persia, he tried to explain how mystical experience was in many ways similar to the scientific experience in the same sense, because there are people, what the scientists experienced is not always something that can be experienced by the laity. You need a certain trained eye at times. Sometimes it can be demonstrated, sometimes it can't be demonstrated unless you have a trained eye. You know how to use a microscope, you know how to play with those scientific technologies before you can even decipher some of the results or some of the factors in play. So it's going to be finally a community of established scientists, obviously, and this is where Michel Foucault also comes in. That scientific community will verify that this was demonstrated in front of us. We looked at it, and this is what and we have, for instance, this is what nothingness is. This is what a black hole is. This is what the cure for cancer this is what cancer really means, and so on and so forth. In terms of, I'll give you one very relevant example, that from psychology. Now, psychology is sometimes seen as a pseudoscience. Others are very, very adamant that's a very hardcore science. But the whole idea of categorization of diseases, and this is what Michel Foucault talked about. About 25 years ago, 30 years ago, homosexuality was seen as a disease. People were incarcerated. It was seen as a sin. Then later on, it was seen as a disease, and it was categorized in psychological manuals as a disease to be treated. Then later on, it was taken out from there. The whole categorization of the mad and the insane, and Michel Foucault has written so much about madness, was seen as a scientific medical reality. And on the basis of this, as Foucault argues, you can actually incarcerate a person, confine his or her freedom by those categorizations. And how scientific is it really? How much of it really depends on the consensus of the community on what has to be categorized? So there is one aspect of science which is based on empiricism, but then that empirical evidence has to be interpreted. And there's the epistemic side of it as well. There's the epistemic side, which is sometimes, as Professor Sikandar right in the beginning of his lecture pointed out, that is sometimes too overlooked. What is the sample? For instance, you say, let's say you say that Pakistanis are becoming more and more prone to drug addiction. If this is a statement, if it's a research statement, and I ask you, where did you get this from? And you say, well, I got this from such and such book, such and such. That's one citation. Then obviously, as a researcher, I'll go into that source. When I look into that source and the source says we did a survey, the first question is going to be, you made a statement about Pakistan. Pakistan is a huge country. It's so diverse. Even the languages are mind-boggling. The diversity of culture is mind-boggling. What was the sample size? What was the population size that you were? How reflective is the sample of the population? How was it selected? Now, these are things that can heavily influence what might be considered, because now the boundaries are closing. Epidemiology is now considered a science, but it's also social sciences area. So empirical evidence at times, both in terms of epistemology and in terms of hermeneutics, can go through the same kinds of rigor of critique as social sciences propositions might. I hope I've answered your question to some extent.
That was great, Asif. I think we have addressed most queries that came in. There are some more that I think are more relevant to the later sessions that come along, because there's something like on how collection of data or challenges qualitative research citations as I see them, research-based educational methods, and so on. So I think these will all be tackled in later sessions. For now, we are open to any other question that you think is relevant to this session. Thank you so much, Asif, for your time. I must say, and as I've always noticed, that your base comes from poetry and religious studies, but the way you use your discipline to explain the different theories and and the different permutations and the connotations within those theories, you do that explains very well coming from your examples. I think that really is very helpful. Very thankful to you. And don't see any other questions. So we hope that this addressed your concerns at this point in time, and you're pretty comfortable, and we'll bid you goodbye. Thank you so much.